Yeah, good afternoon. Welcome those of you who have joined us in this session I look forward to because it is on the important themes of diversity and inclusion. And we have two speakers, André Ulner, if I pronounce it correctly, and Axel Petri Prijs, who will talk from their own research and their own perspectives about these issues of diversity and inclusion. Well, and since we have been together in this symposium already for quite some time, we know the etiquette. There is room for questions after each of the two presentations. And if you have questions, raise your hand virtually or on screen. And yeah, I think this is a good moment to give the floor to André to give his lecture.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you for granting me this opportunity to present our study. And previously we just talked about, usually it takes about 45 minutes to cruise through this study because it's rather complex and it raises and touches a lot of issues that are intertwined. And so I'll be going through this very quickly. And if you have questions, then of course we can talk about it afterwards. So let me share my screen. Now you should see a turquoise screen there. Perfect. Okay. So the study is called 063%, How Diverse Are Orchestras? It's a qualitative individual case study among orchestra musicians with a history of origin from Turkey and the Near and Middle East in and around German professional orchestras. And I've put this quote up on front because it pretty much sums up what we found in the study. Sure, I've experienced prejudice in orchestra. Sure, I've experienced racism. Sure, I've experienced sexism. But yes, when I'm in the orchestra, I'm a string player. And that's nice. And my seatmate is also a string player. And our solo string player is also a string player. So we are musicians. Now, the study was initiated because we started looking at our audience, found out that, or we had the impression that there are no people with a migrational background in the audience. And then we started looking at the data from the ticket sales and found out that's actually not true. There are indeed people with a migrational background in the audience, however, you don't see it. And then we started turning around, looking at the orchestra and raised the question, who is represented in the orchestra? And how does that correspond with the population of the city we are located at? Now, Ludwigshafen is a city in the southwest of Germany, right across the river from the city of Mannheim, and together they form an urban area with about 477,000 people living there, and the largest minority are 45,000 people with a Turkish origin, so almost 10%. And then we have another 3 to 5% of people with an origin from a country from the Near or Middle East. Now, in these two cities, there are 3 professional orchestras with a total of 250 permanent positions. The Deutsche Staatsphilharmonie, which I work for, the orchestra of the Opera House of the Mannheim Theater, and the Kurpfälzische Kammerorchester or Chamber Orchestra. And the above mentioned target groups are not represented in the personnel, and they're also not addressed with the program, and we also don't find them in the audiences in general. Now, let me present the central results and the research design. What defines the surveyed target group? The study is based on the fact that the population structure of the city of Ludwigshafen is not represented in the personnel of our orchestra. In Ludwigshafen, people with a history from Turkey or the Middle or Near East are not represented, and however, they are the largest minorities in the urban area. From a musical point of view, this very heterogeneous target group has in common that maqam-based or so-called Oriental music practices and traditions exist here in contrast to Central European music traditions. This is very important when we look at music education at schools or even at the local music schools, what music is being taught and what music is not being taught, and what parallel structures derive from that. Now, the research design. Why was the survey conducted? The origin is the diversity-oriented opening of our orchestra, and the focus of this study is the personnel of the orchestra. The aim was a better and deeper understanding of the personal situations and experiences of musicians with a history of origin from Turkey or a country of the Near and Middle East. And from this, we aimed at strategies for actions in the following areas: personal development, promotion of young talents, application procedures, positioning in educational policy, program design, and reaching diverse audiences. How was the targeted group to be surveyed determined? Since there have been hardly any studies of this topic in German orchestras with a specific target group, this is a pilot study. We contacted the employers representation of all the orchestras and asked for numbers, and were told there are no numbers, and furthermore they cannot be determined, then we asked if our request could be forwarded to the orchestras, which was also denied. So the only thing we could do was to look at all the websites of all the 129 orchestras and look at each single position of a permanent employed musician and try to find out where this person comes from. And so we looked at biographies, we looked at name-related, we looked at the names and then phenotypical characteristics, and in combination we concluded this could be a person of our target group or not. Now, the research we found within the framework of the present study 62 permanently employed musicians with a family history origin from Turkey or country of the Near and Middle East in the 129 professional orchestras with, at the time, a total of 9,766 positions. This aims to a percentage of 0.63%. Now, we looked at the biographies and we found out that out of these 62 individuals, 4 actually were born in Germany. Most of the rest was born and raised in Turkey. It was possible to research 53 out of the 62 biographies, and we found but one person that had not at least completed a part of its studies at a German conservatory, and this one person that we found is a trumpeter who got into an orchestra by auditioning personally for Daniel Barenboim. And since the quote of studying in Germany at the biographies we found is so high, we conclude that most of the biographies we could not identify, most of them probably have also studied at a German conservatory. So this is a first interim conclusion. If you want to reach a position in a German orchestra, you have to study at a German conservatory. Otherwise, it's very difficult and has very much to do with orchestra traditions in different countries, probably. Now, from the 62 researched and other freelance musicians, 16 were selected, which we tried to get into contact with. Actually, it's not very easy to get into contact with musicians, and what helped us at the time was that due to the pandemic, most orchestras were not playing at the time, so musicians had time to answer the phone or answer emails. And the 16 individuals that we contacted, 10 of which agreed on an interview. We asked of the access to music and the music career. We asked on educational and professional life, support in education, and the views of the role of orchestras in society in general. How were the questions asked and evaluated? We did an individual qualitative biographical interviews using an interview guide. The interviews lasted for about 2 hours each and were recorded. The 10 interviews were transcribed in a smooth manner and agreed upon with the views. The presentation in the study is anonymous. This is very important because we try to get very sensitive data, and we try to keep the level of anonymity as high as possible. First of all, to set a standard for further questions, for further studies in the future, and also because the target group is so small that very little information could actually help to identify the individuals that were questioned. Qualitative content analysis was used for evaluation. Each interview was treated as an individual case, therefore anonymized, and biographies were created in order to be able to trace the personal life courses and careers. In order to be able to derive recommendations, overarching commonalities were also analyzed. Topic interviews of the interview guide was childhood and first access to music, then the studies at the music school and the conservatory, professional life and experience in professional life, the cultural self-image, then orchestras as a part of society in general, and the promotion of young musicians in Germany. At the beginning, a test interview was conducted with a person from the target group. The questionnaire was then reflected upon together with the person in the test interview to see if we had any blind spots or if we were asking questions that were not appropriate. So just to make sure, and what needs to be taken into account, the qualitative study does not claim to be representative, but individual cases are considered for a deeper understanding. The study does not claim to be generally valid for the orchestra scene, but the derivations refer solely to the situation of the Deutsche Staatsphilharmonie Rheinland-Pfalz. There should be no generalization or even othering in the named target group, and all those involved in the conception, in the interviewing, and the evaluation are members of what we call the Mehrheitsgesellschaft, the majority society, or white people, and we cannot exclude that this has influenced the conception, the course, and the content of the interviews. It is the explicit aim of the study to suggest a broadening of the target group to be interviewed, as well as of the methodological procedure. So we invite other orchestras to, or the union or the employer's representation to conduct further studies. Am I at the 10 minutes?
Andre, yes, you are.
Then I'll speed up a little bit. I've tried to make experienceable what these 10 individuals were in order to raise the level of anonymity. We only questioned 5 people from orchestras, as well as 5 freelance musicians around the orchestras. Now you see most of the interviewed persons were people with a Turkish origin, and we've tried to represent the 62 individuals statistically in the questioned personnel. Results of the interview. We found out that there apparently is a rising number of students of Turkish origin in Germany, or more specific, Turkish music students from Turkey that change over to finish their studies at the German conservatories. And as we've concluded earlier, music studies at a German conservatory plays obviously a major role for a later employment in a German orchestra. When we talked about, or we asked about the experiences at the music schools or the conservatories, there was hardly any institutional disadvantages told upon, perceived at the German music conservatories. The successfully completed auditions were described as being normal. There was no disadvantages perceived. Actually, we had some people told us that there was applause after they had played for the orchestra that they got employed in, or that they were perceived very cordially by the members of the orchestra. Another general thing that we found is that the level of performance in generally is valued higher than the origin of the individual musician. Another very sensitive issue is that racism in general, or what we call Alltagsrassismus, everyday racism, has not been identified as a relevant and effective issue that that influences the interaction between musicians of minorities and majorities within the orchestra. And orchestras apparently also do not have sufficiently fulfilled their duty to take care for the employees against discrimination. There's a federal law stating that you have to initiate a group within your institution that takes care of discrimination issues, and this is actually a lack of knowledge within the orchestras that they are obliged as the employers to initialize such a group. We also found that the questioned personnel had a oscillating identity, changing within their family origin and a German identity, but in general, the longer the musician remained in Germany, the more German they perceived themselves, and they started looking more critical at the country that they came from originally. Something that we found out, and we talked about this earlier, just before the session started, the people that we interviewed appeared to us just as any other musician that we could talk to in an orchestra, apart from the fact that they had a origin from Turkey or a country of the Near and Middle East. There was nothing really that differentiated them from any other orchestra musician. And we found out that they had little, if no, contact to anyone in their city or in society in general with the same origin as themselves, but outside of the orchestra world. And when you are in contact with a lot of orchestra musicians, you can find out that most of them stay within the realm of that orchestra world. A lot of musicians even are children of parents who, at least one of which, has already worked as an orchestra musician. Now, something else that can be developed or could be developed, that musicians on an individual basis understand themselves as a role model, for example, for children to pick up an instrument and develop the wish to become an orchestra musician. Now, the low level of change in the orchestra world in general is perceived as a problem in general, and the interviewed persons also stated that they don't think that the place of an orchestra in society is so, now I don't know the English word, selbstverständlich, it's so self-evident as it has been in the past. What they also stated by themselves without us asking them was that orchestras actually have a potential for social diverse identification model, since there are so many people from different backgrounds working together and aiming at the same goal and working successfully together. A programmatic opening of orchestras is viewed positively with, for example, transcultural or transgenre programs. However, each individual stated that the main repertoire should stay in the center of orchestras. the proximity to education and early intensive contact at early childhood with classical music is beneficial. I think this is very obvious. And they also stated that orchestras should raise their engagement at the local schools. And what was specifically noted on is that the parents of the children should be more involved in order to get more into contact. Yeah, this is the last foil, so I conclude my presentation, and I hope I stayed within the 15 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, André, and your timekeeping is excellent. Not just your timekeeping, also your presentation. So thanks for that. And I now want to open the floor for questions to André. I see one from Raluca. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong type of hands. Actually, Anna, and then Jutta. Anna, please.
Yes, thank you so much, André, for the really interesting presentation and really interesting study. I have a couple of questions. Well, related to, I actually have many questions, but I will just ask a few. Related to the beginning, you said that you didn't get the statistics from the orchestras. Can you tell something more about that, perhaps unwillingness to cooperate? And then what does this tell about like the orchestra auditions according to you? Like how do the auditions should be maybe organized differently or somehow in order to diversify orchestras? Or is it so that there's still not so many musicians in conservatories from then like Turkish or Middle East origin? Or do they correlate with these statistics? Thanks.
Now, the first part of your question, the data, that's actually a very sensitive issue, not only in Germany, but in Europe and in general. This has to do with data security. The origin of musicians is, I think it's not being evaluated. There are no numbers, and it's a very sensitive topic. So I can understand that it was not possible to get the numbers from the employer's representation. Now, the other part of your question, the audition procedures, that's sort of the gold question. And if anyone would have the answer to that question, we would leap giantly forward. I think what would really help at this point is the discussion about all these topics is mainly led by people who are not professional musicians themselves. And I think this leads to the fact that any of these discussions are rejected from the musicians themselves. So I think what could be the next step is actually to found a group of orchestra musicians that would start looking at procedures, be sensitized for these issues, and develop a method or a curriculum themselves that could be presented to other orchestra musicians. I think that would be the next logic step, actually.
Thank you. Jutta?
Yes, hi. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I did not know German orchestras have these kind of posts as you apparently hold. So a compliment for that to the orchestra that you're working for is quite amazing. I was wondering, what do you do now with this kind of knowledge that you've gained? What's the next step for you in your, your work? That would be really interesting to know.
For me, personal?
No, I mean, what do you do with the learnings from your research? Besides, can you implement that somehow, or?
If you look at the study, which is presented at our website, I can post the link later. We have developed reactions to the learnings, and that would be the other half hour of presentation. to present what we've learned from that. Yeah, actually, I think the next logic step for my orchestra that I work for is to include musicians on a personal level, to make them understand that this is something that actually touches them personal. I think when you look at the statistics of population, I think within the next 20 years, now Germany has the largest number of orchestras in the world, but I think in the next 20 years, a lot of orchestras will be closed, just simply due to the development of the population. And I think this is something that musicians don't understand yet. And I think the best thing is to make them understand that and get them involved on a personal level.
Okay, thank you. We have two questions left by Axel and Paulina. Yeah, and now Gerald also raises his hand. So if you can keep the questions brief. Mm-hmm. Axel.
Yes, thank you, Andre, for this really interesting insights. I would like to touch upon something that you quoted from the musicians, saying that the orchestra could be a socially diverse identification model. And the reason they think so was, you said, because so different people work together. And I find that interesting because this is mainly based on, I would say, ethnic diversity, but doesn't include other diversity categories.
Absolutely.
Like, for example, class or education. And this is also a reason, I think, for what you said, that all the musicians are so similar, because they're similar in terms of class and education. So, I mean, what's your thoughts on this? Wouldn't this be a really interesting thing to go for more diversity in other categories than just ethnic diversity?
I absolutely agree. And it made me think of one thing. When you look in the past 20, 30 years of how orchestras were put together, I found one thing that's very interesting. When you look at the colleagues that come from, for example, Romania or Bulgaria or Hungary, they had a different music education system. This is something that in the study we also found to be true in Turkey and in Egypt, which has a conservatory system where children were raised in music, starting at the 5th grade. In Turkey, for example, you would enter a conservatory and had a teacher that would follow you as a teacher up until conservatory, or maybe even through conservatory. So, the system actually helped that that children, talented children from all different social backgrounds had an access to music. Now, this is something that cannot be done simply in Germany, but it gives interesting insights to overcome that barrier, for example. What can orchestras do in schools to get more access for children that come from working class families, for example?
Thank you. Paulina.
Thank you, Andre, for the interesting input. And I wanted to ask you how you stand for quotas in orchestras, also at a personal level, but also how maybe does your institution that see? Yeah.
I
will repeat maybe. Yeah. What's your opinion on quotas, like for orchestra, and maybe on a personal level, but also how does your institution look at that?
On quotas.
Quotas, yeah.
Probably as an interim solution, I think it's something that would be helpful. You could argue on that on an artistic level, but I think when you look at other fields, for gender equality, for example, I think for an interim time, I think that would be very effective. Yes.
Okay, that's a important question and a Important answer. And the last question is for Gerald.
Well, it's not a question in that sense, because I wrote the foreword of this study. I was invited by Andre and his colleagues. And so I got a little bit more in-depth details of the whole study. And the last question you touched down was the quota. I'm not a friend of quota in the artistic field, because we have the discussion about, shall we have a quota for men, women in an orchestra, or shall we have a quota for how many female conductors do we have, etc., etc. And the point is, in the artistic field, when you have a quota for a certain, maybe you are a foreigner or you are female, male, whatever, the point is in the artistic field that people say, or musicians in the orchestra say, okay, this is our quota, men or women, and not on the artistic quality. So that it might be a rather slippery ground. So I'm not a friend of this. One point, so we have in German orchestras, we have a percentage of 27% of musicians in the German orchestras are not born here. So roughly 1/3 is from China, from Japan, from US, wherever. So the study itself has a very small percentage, of course, because it's only looking on the Turkish and Near East community, which is clear, of course, if you look on the German population statistics. So because we have a huge Turkish community since maybe 50 years or so, and still growing. And so this is the point. And the main point from my perspective is that that parents from these Turkish communities have, or most of the parents have no really idea of higher music education, so that they really bring the children into the music school and starting the violin. You have to start with 5 years, etc., etc. So it's a lack of music understanding for higher music education, at least. And I think this is a problem. If you want to change this, you have to touch down, and this is what you said, you have to touch down to the Turkish families, to the parents, and so on and so on. So it's a very long journey you have to go until things will change. But I'm not that pessimistic as Andre that we will have vanishing 20 orchestras in the next 20 years. This is not my job, of course. Yeah, I'm always for the upkeep of orchestras and trying to promote initiatives to bring them better up. And I think the point which you make is very important to discuss about the audience, about the staff, and about the diversity of programming. I think the what we call the 3 Ps, yeah? Programm, Publikum, Personal. These are the target points we have to tackle. And we ourselves and our association, I think we will start in the next few months with having an own working group on gender equality and diversity, just to tackle this problem together with musicians and together with experts as an umbrella perspective, maybe to have not only the study, but to have other surveys, other studies, and bring it down to the orchestra world.
Yeah, thank you, Gerald, for your comments. I see, Andre, that you raised your hand, but every word you say goes at the expense of Axel.
I'll be very brief. Just one short remark. I would also question what is higher music education. I think that's a question that we have to look at. What actually is that, and who defines what higher education actually is? And the other thing, just real brief, we had the 3 Ps: program, partners, program, Personal, Programm, Publikum, but we also have a 4th P, which is partners, and that I think is also very important.
Yeah. I think this is a nice link to our next presentation by Axel Petri Prijs, who is at the Universität für Musik und Darstellung und Kunst in Vienna, and his research focuses on Musikvermittlung, the German term for audience and community engagement. Axel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen and start my presentation. I hope you can all see it. Great. So thank you, Peter, for the kind introduction and also the invitation and the possibility for me to present this paper today. I'm also sending greetings from Sarashaka. We planned originally to do this presentation together, but unfortunately she can't be here today, so I'm going to do this alone. I changed the title just a little bit using the English term music mediation now instead of Musikvermittlung, the German term. Although I have argued in a recent English language publication that the English term music mediation, as a literal translation of this German term Musikvermittlung, may lead to misunderstandings in the global academic community due to its semantic diversity. I've nevertheless decided to use it in the context of this conference, and I'm coming back to this in a minute. As we all know, music is a Janus-faced phenomenon that, as a culturally significant practice, can prove ethically to be a medium either for good or bad. Music can socially exclude people in many ways, and we have touched upon this already yesterday in the round table, for example, in regard to classical music, and it can in the worst case even degenerate into practices of terror and horror, as Christoph Kittel recently argued. On the other hand, however, music has a cohesive and inclusive potential and can, once again referring to Christoph Kittel, become a practice of the humane. Anna Bull yesterday argued that in the face of societal transformations, classical music itself has to change. And I agree, with an understanding of music not as a thing, an artifact, but as a social practice. This doesn't mean we can't play Beethoven anymore, but the way how we deal with Beethoven has to change. In other words, it is the distinct doings and sayings realized in a practice that characterize the practice in terms of normative organizational structures, such as shared understandings, including ethics, rules, and ends. In music, as in any practice, these are not fixed a priori, but are the subject of negotiation processes. In terms of an ethically grounded concept of music and the arts, David Elliott and colleagues, for example, have presented an important theoretical approach in the form of artistic citizenship. In my paper today, I will argue that practices of music mediation may productively and critically use the cohesive potential of music to work on shared values and cultural practices in a radically individualized late modern society, and at the same time transform a highly exclusive classical concert life. In doing so, I'm essentially referring to the concept of doing universality by Andreas Reckwitz, a German sociologist. And I'm picking up on ideas that Sarah Schaka and I have begun to explore in our volume Tuning Up the Innovative Potential of Musikvermittlung, which was recently published open access with Transcript. First off, for those of you who are not so familiar with the discourse around Musikvermittlung or music mediation, I would like to offer two definitions. In our upcoming handbook on music mediation, Johannes Voigt and I formulate a rather wide definition. Music mediation refers to a wide range of artistic educational practices that foster diverse relationships between people and musics. And here is also a narrower definition formulated by Sarah Schaka and myself. By music mediation, we mean the manifold and divergent practices in an artistic educational field in which actors with heterogeneous formal qualifications and different professional backgrounds are currently elaborating and implementing specialized artistic educational concepts for and with various social groups in relation to music, mostly on behalf of public institutions. Historically, music mediation practices have evolved, especially within the last 25 years, as an artistic educational field of practice whose actors deal specifically with the possibilities of the musical and cultural participation of different and heterogeneous population groups, as well as with questions of social and cultural inclusion in classical concert life. This is because the field of so-called classical music has until now been a symbol of power and of the claim of the white bourgeoisie to domination, evoking social delimitation and the cultural exclusion of others. Contrary to this observation, musicians and artistic directors in the field of classical music like to emphasize the unifying and soul-enriching power of music, meaning classical music. Especially in the last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, this discourse has become the argumentative basis for the loudly proclaimed societal and systemic relevance of orchestras and concert halls. Behind this, however, very often lies a concept of universalism originating in bourgeois modernism, which today has rightly come under criticism for its elitism, its concept of culture narrowed to phenomena of high culture, and its Eurocentrism. The contemporary classical concert business, as a child of bourgeois modernism, still clings to this understanding and sees the cultural standards and assets of a small group, namely the white European bourgeoisie, as a generally binding standard. Everything that doesn't correspond to this, for example, popular, folk, or youth culture, is classified as inferior and devalued. As I have formulated before, practitioners of music mediation as cultural translators or intermediaries work against this tendency, fostering diverse relationships between people and musics. However, they are confronted with two sets of critique, especially in the German language discourse. The emphasis on community building as a purpose and an all too uncritical invocation of the cohesive potential of music are, in the tradition of Adorno's Kritik des Musikanten, in English, Critique of Non-Reflective Musicianship, criticized as neo-musisch in reference to the ideologically abused musische Erziehung employed during National Socialism. Christoph Kittel writes, quote, "Actually, only music education concepts which are ideologically suspect and historically demonstrably guilty of indoctrination, such as musische Erziehung, see their purpose in the unifying community-building character of music." End of quote. On the other hand, critics state that there is a danger that music mediation, in the sense of affirmative audience development, perpetuates the power structures within the field of classical music, along with its mechanisms of distinction and social exclusion. Ardila Mantilla and colleagues suggest that music mediation may represent the attempt of the powerful in the artistic field to define the artistic practices of other groups as deficient, to deny them their value and raison d'etre, and thus to perpetuate their own power. End of quote. A very recent example for this that I found online is the description of school children as musikfern, which in English means something like unmusical or far from music, by Rhapsody in School, which is a program in which professional classical musicians play concerts and conduct workshops in schools, which implicitly shows how the children's own musical practices are radically devalued compared to those of classical music. It is important for the practitioners of music mediation to take this critique very seriously, to critically reflect on it and further develop their practice in order to achieve the goals of social and cultural inclusion and participation. One important theoretical approach in this regard may be Andreas Reckwitz's concept of doing universality, which I will now elaborate on. Andreas Reckwitz analyzes and describes late modern society as a society of singularities, which is oriented towards the production of uniqueness. Individuality, particularity, and the extraordinary are socially rewarded. According to Reckwitz, processes of singularization take place using two mutually contradictory logics. On the one hand, there is hyperculture, as the logic of the affluent, cosmopolitan new middle class, which finds countless possibilities for individual self-development between arts and food, travel and spirituality, education and physical culture. On the other hand, the second logic of singularization, cultural essentialism, promises to fill the voids of hyperculture that lie in the absence of the collective and of generally binding norms. At the center of this logic, cultural essentialism, is collective identity, the group, the community, versus the radical individualism of hyperculture. A clear boundary, however, is established between those who are in the group and those who are outside the group. Culture is not a matter of negotiation here, but a non-negotiable starting point. Cultural essentialism is carried above all by population groups that perceive themselves as modernization losers and feel threatened by the complexity of late modernity. The various cultural essentialisms include nationalism, religious fundamentalism, or right-wing populism. Reichwitz argues that in a singularized and increasingly polarized society, in which commonly shared values and norms, as well as cultural practices, cannot be taken for granted, there is a need for a culture of the general that takes a middle course, filling the voids of hyperculture, which are community and common norms on the one hand, but on the other hand, not falling into cultural essentialist patterns. He calls this doing universality. In other words, if in the extreme there is no longer anything shared that could claim validity across the boundaries between individuals or lifestyle groups, then practices are needed that establish both social and cultural universality. And I quote Reichwitz, "Doing universality fosters neither antagonism between collectives nor apathy about their differences. Instead, it follows a logic of universal participation, though at the same time, it requires that all sides make an effort toward enculturation." End of quote. He attributes, and this is where it becomes interesting for us, great potential to state institutions, especially educational or cultural institutions such as theaters or concert halls. Reichwitz's concept of doing universality may provide inspiration regarding how music mediation can unfold the cohesive potential of music, both reflectively and critically in terms of power relations and existing hierarchies, in order to work on shared values and cultural practices in a radically individualized society. Doing universality is a process of negotiation, a continuous work on what is to be shared. The universal doesn't exist a priori, but must be manufactured in repeated joint processes. The subject of such negotiation processes could be, for example, the value of cultural practices and artifacts with the aim of broadening our understanding of aesthetic practice and the notion of culture, or extra musical issues such as social interaction, solidarity, or equality. In contrast to cultural essentialism, it doesn't assume the homogeneity of society, but rather in its inescapable cultural heterogeneity in which the negotiation of the general is grounded. In this regard, Robert Putnam states, quote, "To build bridging social capital requires that we transcend our social and political and professional identities to connect with people unlike ourselves. In this context, interactions between people who are demonstrably dissimilar on grounds such as age, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, and education are seen as an important resource and the starting point for doing universality." Due to the time restriction of 15 minutes, I will not provide you with practice examples at this point. However, I've brought 2 examples from Vienna for how doing universality could be applied in practice, and I will be happy to share them with you in the following Q&A if you're interested. In summary, the concept of doing universality can, in my view, be a theoretical foundation for how music mediation in a late modern, radically individualized society, and I might add even more so in post-pandemic times, can contribute to negotiating and remanufacturing collectively shared practices and values in an era of division and polarization by bringing people into an exchange with and through music. In this way, the practice of music mediation could build on the cohesive and inclusive potential of music as a practice of the humane, acting as a social as well as cultural bridge builder and a transformer of what has remained an exclusive classical concert life. I look forward to our discussion and your questions, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Axel, for your presentation, thoughtful presentation. And I want to open the floor for questions. Okay, yeah. Oh, Neil. Okay, Neil, you have a question.
Just thank you very much for the presentation, Axel. One very hopefully quite straightforward question. I'm sure you said this, but just to make it super clear for me, the difference between the doing universality that you're describing and the sort of assumed universality of the classical tradition that you highlight as a problem.
Yeah, thank you very much. Doing universality is a negotiation process, which this cultural universalism from bourgeois modernism isn't, because this cultural universalism puts those bourgeois standards and assets in the foreground, or focuses on them, and devalues everything else. And doing universality is work on is common work, joint work on something that might be universal. So it's doing something together and building something together, manufacturing something together that might work as universal.
Thanks very
much.
So
this is the big difference. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? I maybe echo the question in the chat from Paulina, where she says she would like to hear a bit more about your examples. I think that would be interesting.
Sure. If I may, I will share my screen again. There are two examples I would like to show you and tell you about. Just a second. First one is from Musikverein Vienna. And I briefly said something yesterday about it. I think this is a strategic partnership between the Musikverein Vienna, which is one of the world's most traditional concert halls and maybe the epitome of bourgeois high culture, and the Brunnenpassage, which is a socio-cultural center in Vienna's culturally very heterogeneous 16th district. So it is quite, I would say, outrageous that those two very, very different institutions work together in a strategic partnership. And this is because Musikverein Vienna wants to learn how to open up for a diverse society. And as part of this partnership, which is over 3 years, there will be, among other things, a program track entitled Frequencies of the Present, in which different musical styles and practices will be confronted and combined. At the opening concert, for example, the Niederösterreichische Tonkünstlerorchester will perform together with Vienna-based singers of different ethnic and musical backgrounds. In another concert, the Wiener Singverein, which is the concert choir of the Musikverein, together with the Brunnenpassage choir and the audience, will perform a paragraph from The Great Learning by Cornelius Cardew. And this whole strategic partnership is also flanked by discussion and conversation formats with all stakeholders involved in order to trigger transformation. So this is one example. And another example I can show you is a concert series at the Vienna Konzerthaus that is called Klangberührt, which in English is touched by sound. And initially, it was intended to make it possible for people with disabilities in particular to attend concerts. The seating was removed for this purpose, creating space for wheelchairs, as well as for cardboard boxes that function as mobile seats. Instead of playing on a raised stage, the musicians play in the hall at eye level with the audience. And the effect of their music is also enhanced by a light dramaturgy. A moderator guides the audience through the concert. And together with the musicians, she also performs a participatory music-making action with the audience. The musical program for the concert series is stylistically very broad and ranges from jazz to traditional music to contemporary classical music. And also traditional concert rituals are largely suspended. So physical participation in the music by dancing, rocking, or swaying, as well as spontaneous singing, or like spontaneously expressing emotions, is made explicitly possible. And the interesting thing is that this informal character appeals not only to people with disabilities, obviously, but also to people who desire a greater closeness and immediacy. And so a much more symmetrical understanding of the relationship between producers and recipients of arts arises during the concert. And people of different ages meet at these concerts, subscription audiences, as well as concert newcomers, people with and without disabilities. So this is a really, in my view, a really inclusive concert format. So these are just two examples.
Yeah, thanks. I find them really interesting and enlightening also. Who would like to ask a question? Andre.
One thing that I come across in my work all the time is the logic of the institution and the logic of the target group. And we've come to formats that that we cannot plan. For example, the Mannheim Children's Theater has invited target groups to performances, and it was very challenging for them to do that because up until 2 minutes before the start of the performance, they will not know who will show up. And it's very tough to plan something, but they've learned that there's no other way. Tomorrow night we will do a Ramadan concert talk at the Philharmonic, at our Philharmonie, and I don't know who's going to show up. We have some musicians. We have a ney player and we have a balama player. I think they will come, but I'm not 110% sure. And it's something that I just have to, agree upon if I want to get into contact. We will plan a Transcultural music festival in May, and some of the target group, there's a Kurdish cultural Verein. They will play music and they will do dances and provide food. And I have never talked to them. I've only talked to them through a middle person. When I call them, they don't pick up the phone. And I cannot talk to them about planning. How many tables do you need? Do you need microphones? How large does the stage has to be? I cannot plan it. And but if I want them to show up, that's just something I have to accept. That's the only way to get into contact. So that's what I mean when talking about institutional logic. Not talking about people, but talking with people. And the first thing is to overcome our own horizon in order to get into contact.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is maybe the pivotal thing, not to talk about them or do something for them or for somebody, but to do it together and to talk with them. And this lies at the heart of the concept of doing universality as a constant, strenuous negotiation process. And I think it's worth it in the end. I think it's worth taking this this process in doing this.
Thank you, Axel. Yeah, I also agree, and it is also incredibly important for renewing the practice of classical music itself. And so it's not just bringing something, but also inviting to be changed ourselves, and to put it that way. Okay, I think we have come to the end of this really interesting session. Thanks to Axel and André for their presentations, and also for your questions and comments. As you will by now have heard, our keynote speaker is not able to give her presentation. We're all very sorry about that. And this means that the next session at 2:30 will be also the last session in the symposium. And I hope to see you all there, so in half an hour. See you then.